Hello watch enthusiasts. Now every January we see a number of watches released by the Richemont Group, as well as small independents at SIHH. However, in terms of watches released there, a great number of these watches are released prior to the show, and indeed to synchronise with this large release of new watches, various groups such as the Swatch Group primarily also release their set of new watches for the start of the year prior to Baselworld. And so in this video I'd like to cover some of the most interesting ones which have been released prior to SIHH, in terms of an opening to these large-scale releases that we'll see later in the month. However, before I begin the video, I would as always like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is, as you know, my group on Snups, which is a social media platform where you can share pictures of your collections and your interests, and discuss matters of horology on my group, which is the Watch Guys, with other enthusiasts and indeed myself if you have any questions or video requests, and I'll certainly strive to reply to them all personally. And so for today's featured picture from that group, we have this fantastic image of the Hamilton Khaki Pilot Day Date by the watch Viking. And this is a fantastic looking take on the Flieger concept of watch. And of course this watch is merely inspired by those German World War II pilots' watches, and of course it's a far more reasonable size and features far more complex finishing and polishing. And of course that anthracite dial is a fantastic piece with that segmented section of 12 hours at the centre of the dial and the minutes around the edge. And of course this does feature in Interstellar as the watch of choice, and is a great looking piece in terms of representing that classic style in a modern context. Now the first watch I'd like to talk about is a very interesting new Seiko Presage. Now of course the Presage line has been very popular over the last 3 years in terms of its enamel models, and Seiko have rekindled the spirit of this watch, which usually comes with a white enamel dial, though a black version was visible in the range for a while a couple of years ago. And they've released a new piece which is called the Presage Blue Enamel Limited Edition. And this watch is inspired by Japan's fascination and interest in the moon and ceremonies which celebrated the moon in terms of medieval Japan. And the design of this watch is of course very much in line with their other Seiko Presage models in this classic line, with these curved polished flanks and then brushed tops to the lugs, with very rounded edges and a polished bezel. Additionally, it has an onion crown which is properly signed, and I think fits with the design of this watch very well, and resembles something you would expect from the 1950s rather than a modern timepiece, though in a size which is far more suited to a modern wrist, at 40.5mm with a thickness of 12.4mm. And beneath the anti-reflective sapphire crystal, which, by the way, does appear to suggest that Seiko is very much moving in the direction of fitting its dress watches with sapphire, whilst leaving its dive watches with hardlex for the purpose of greater shock resistance rather than the ultimate scratch resistance of sapphire. And beneath this we see this wonderful dark blue enamel dial, which is this wonderful glossy finish, which, as you can see, does give those undulations of the fact that it was liquid enamel originally. So it runs into that central hole in the centre of the dial where the hands protrude, as well as the date aperture being very curved and one could say uneven simply because of the application of the enamel. But in many ways this just gives a wonderful, deep and very rich dark blue, which wouldn't be achievable otherwise. And one could argue that one beauty of having an enamel dial is the fact that it doesn't fade in the same way as a painted dial will, and so as a result leaves this wonderful colour pretty much indefinitely on the surface of the dial. And of course this depends on what type of enamel is used, but this is generally the case with these ceramic finishes. The hands are then these very classical shapes which are extremely legible in terms of being bright white on that blue background, with white paint being applied to these hands, as well as having these white lacquered indices on the surface of the dial, and a railway style of second track around the edge. Furthermore, the second hand is left bare in terms of steel, but it has this glittering moon on the counterbalance of the second hand, which is finished with a sort of a gold tint, which allows it to again represent the moon's influence on Japanese culture, and in this case their watchmaking. Around the inside of the exhibition caseback of this watch, we also see a golden crescent as another nod to this. And this watch is a limited edition of 1,500 pieces and features the Seiko 6R15 movement, which is a modification, I suppose you could say, on their standard movement architecture, with a slightly extended power reserve of 50 hours, which is a practical touch, I feel, for a watch of this price, and does give the watch a little bit more versatility. But it does beat at 3 Hz, which is something which is, for this price, something I think that Seiko, in the present instance, do need to work on in terms of increasing the beat rate of their watches, especially in their dress watches, for the simple reason that whereas it's perfectly reasonable to go for a more rugged movement in a sports watch, I feel it would be nice to see a little bit more refinement in this timepiece as far as a dress watch goes. But alongside this 1500-piece model, which is a version which will be sold worldwide for around $1,100, there is also a non-limited JDM version, so a Japanese domestic model, which won't be a limited edition. And this won't feature the golden moon on the second hand, or indeed the golden motifs on the caseback, but this will still feature the rest of the details for 108,000 yen, which is about $950. So a slight price drop, but nonetheless, I think if one can get hold of one with the golden crescents, it really is a beautiful watch. Now, Damasko have also released 2 new models which are very interesting, and the model I'd like to talk about the most is the DC80, but I feel it's worthwhile mentioning the DS30, which is their new bottom-of-the-range model. And when said like that, it doesn't seem like much, but this has become, I feel, a genuine competitor to the Zin 556. And Damasko previously had pricing which started really at £1,000, whilst this watch now drops to £875, but incorporates most of their technology. And it does have an ETA 2824 as its most basic element, but it does still have their ice-hardened nickel-free stainless steel case, with its self-lubricating crown, negative pressure-resistant case, as well as the 100-metre water resistance, and all the various other features in terms of additional hardness to the steel, and additional care taken with anti-magnetism of this watch. However, it's presented in this very affordable package, bearing in mind the features this watch offers, with an extremely clean dial design. And also the sizing of this watch is a really brilliant choice at 39mm by only 9.9mm thick, making this possibly one of the best versatile watches released this month. However, the Damasko DC80 is a piece released this month which has caught my interest in terms of offering a complication which is both rare in terms of these technical watches, and which also proves that Zin's production of their four-hand chronograph was ill-chosen, I think, of their EZM 1.1, which costs in excess of twice the price of this watch, and was, of course, a limited edition. And this is the Damasko DC80, which is a 43mm by 14mm 100-metre water-resistant chronograph. And this takes a very simplified approach to the chronograph, with a countdown bezel which is bidirectional and mounted on ball bearings for added security, as well as having their ice-hardened nickel-free stainless steel case, which is also available with their Damask black coating, which is 2,500 Vickers, making it far in excess harder than normal stainless steel, and indeed comparable to ceramic. And as ever with Damaskos, these are designed to last, as of course I've said they're extremely scratch resistant in terms of their hardness, as well as having crowns and pushers which are specially designed for reduced damage in terms of dust intake and indeed any water ingress, with pushers and indeed a crown which self-lubricate, which is something very clever in terms of the screw-in crown. Additionally, the dial is this matte black with nothing other than Damasko on it, and of course these are German watches made for the most technical of purposes, whilst the bezel follows the same approach of simply having numerals and luminescent material. And the dial itself has crosshairs as well, which is again a reference to older pilots' watches, but the design of this watch is very contemporary, with this twin-pusher chronograph setup based on the Veltro 7750. However, it's been modified here to work with a central minute and central second indicator. And so what one loses from this conversion is ultimate functionality, because this watch has had its day-date complication removed, as well as also losing the ability to judge hours for the chronograph, as well as being able to have a clear readout of the running seconds of the watch. So instead of that, you simply have the hour hand and the minute hand, with these two other hands running the chronograph. And so you have a standard central second hand for that, in addition to that minute hand with that aviation-style tip, which rotates around the dial once an hour. And this does allow you to time things in a much more visible way. And in a sense, the hours aren't lost altogether, because you can simply set the bezel to the hour hand and use that to judge how many hours you've been timing for. And so this allows you to read the watch much more quickly and gives a very unique look into the way a pilot's watch should be in terms of providing ultimate legibility. And of course, as a pilot's instrument, this is unparalleled, with a 1000 Gauss anti-magnetism, as well as the negative pressure resistance these watches have to be able to survive. And so these are extremely robust and rugged timepieces, and of course the design of the watch is very much in keeping with that, with nothing glamorous about this watch, but purely functional. And as a result, I do think it's impressive that Damasko are able to make a watch of this type, bearing in mind how small a company they are, for between £2,325 and £2,836. And this does depend on which model you go for, with the bare steel models being less than the Damask black models, as well as each option having the ability to have a bracelet, which is, again, a beautifully engineered piece with every link having visible screws for you to be able to change links out if an individual link is damaged, which is something very typical of the brand in terms of providing the ultimate level of sturdiness for use. And additionally, you can get the watch either with white indices and markers, as well as with green ones for a slightly different and bolder look, though I must say my personal favourite is the simple white. Now the next watch I'd like to talk about is the Jaeger-LeCoultre Geophysic True Second Limited Edition. And the Geophysic was a model which was produced from 1958, and was a dress watch with a crosshair dial. And they've continued this style of watch, and they produced for a few years now a version of this watch by the name of the Geophysic, but without this crosshair dial, and with a style which was rather different to the original 1958 version. But earlier this month, JLC have released a new version, a 100-piece limited edition, internet limited edition as well, which features this beautiful crosshair dial on this sunburst blue background. And of course, being a dress watch, JLC have chosen a very respectable size for this watch of 39.6mm, making it not too small for large wrists, but still a reasonable size. And the detailing on this watch is just phenomenal, with details such as, for example, the second hand, which isn't a single plane, but rather the length of the second hand extends from a thicker and larger central section and counterbalance, which are details which you wouldn't normally see at all. Furthermore, the hands themselves are wonderfully detailed and curved over as they're polished, in a similar way to the faceted indices. And continuing that sort of theme, the luminescent material which is seen on the hands is continued in these small, very vintage-style pips around the edge of the rehaut of the dial, rather than having that style of luminescent indices which would perhaps corrupt the design. And of course, this watch is also fitted with that wonderful JLC logo, which works extremely well on this watch and matches the indices very, very well. And of course, one does also have those crosshairs, which is a very, very nice touch and a nice throwback to the original piece. And the case of the watch also features this wonderful finish of this very simple polished finish, but with all the necessary details to make it nothing boring at all, with these small cuts on top of the lugs, as well as small brushed sections between the lugs, and a generally very careful, constrained, but beautifully executed case design. And of course there is the primary complication of the watch, which is that dead second, or true second complication, or seconde morte. And this is courtesy of the Caliber 770, an in-house movement from JLC, with a fantastic gold rotor which is cut out with that JLC logo. And this is rather clever because, of course, a watch would be incredibly inaccurate if its balance wheel only oscillated 60 times a minute, or 3,600 times an hour, rather than the usual 28,800 beats per hour at which this watch beats. And so as a result it uses a remontoir to be able to draw the energy to then release as a single tick, which of course is in some ways counterproductive because of course many people buy automatic watches to move away from quartz watches. But in this context you are getting a complication which is really remarkable and is something which isn't seen terribly often due to its lack of immense popularity. But I think with such gorgeous movement visible through that exhibition caseback, there really is a lot to see with this watch. And the price for this watch is 10,400 Swiss francs, and there were only 100 pieces made. But nonetheless, this is a very interesting piece, and a beautiful one nonetheless. Now, the last two watches in this list are notable for how thin they are. And the first is the new Piaget Altiplano 910p. And Piaget had previously held the record for the slimmest mechanical watch ever made with their Altiplano previously, and this was then superseded. But Piaget have decided to try and have another attack at the world's thinnest mechanical watch, but now in the segment of the automatic winding watch. And so they're using the 910p. And this is a 41mm wide wristwatch, which is only 4.3mm thick, which is a baffling thickness, bearing in mind the fact that most leather straps are thicker than that at the lug end. And the case of this watch comes in both rose gold for $26,000, or for $27,000 it comes in white gold. And this is a watch which is uncompromising in terms of its pursuit of being slim, and I must say I respect Piaget enormously for it. And this watch is uncompromising in the sense that it's been built entirely for the purpose of being slim. For example, the case back is actually the base plate of the movement, so one actually has to lift the top of the watch off, and the case back remains part of the movement, which is a curious part of this watch. Similarly, the movement and dial has been conceived specifically to reduce the thickness of the watch, with the dial and hands being a section which often adds a great deal of height to a watch, being inset into the movement, because the movement is built around the dial, which is eccentrically placed. Also, the whole movement is designed to fit within the height of its thickest component, being the balance assembly, which is placed, as you can see, on the left-hand side of the watch. And the whole watch also features a rotor for the automatic winding, which is very unconventional. It is actually that black ring you see around the dial with 910p printed on it. And this is a PVD-coated 22-carat gold rotor, which rotates the full circumference of the watch, and gold has been used because it's much denser than other metals, and so as a result allows a smaller rotor to have sufficient mass to be able to wind efficiently. And of course, the detailing on this watch is really beautiful, with the dial being beautifully designed with those two levels in different colours and those gold hands. And this contrasts the very technical aspects of that movement. And normally I would describe a watch like this as being a little bit too fussy in terms of the amount of movement visible, but I think bearing in mind the pursuit of a particular aim, this is perfectly justified. And one realises just how extreme a concept this is when one finds out the fact the crystal has had to be designed specifically not to press on the hands, and so all the bridges of the movement actually sit higher than the dial itself in order to prevent that. Because on something like a Rolex Deep Sea, the crystal is near as makes no difference, the same thickness as this entire watch, which is a remarkable thing to consider. And of course, this watch is not going to win any awards for durability, but it does show the extreme nature of what Piaget have managed to do here. And of course, the 900p is still a slimmer watch, but of course that doesn't have the automatic winding, and is still a sort of a smaller watch in terms of its form factor, in terms of width as well, because it sits at 38mm, whereas this is 41 to accommodate that rotor. And what really places this watch in a league of its own, and certainly makes it all the more impressive, is the fact the nearest watch in terms of thickness is the Bulgari Octo Finissimo Ultra Thin, which comes in at 5.15mm, which, though a very small difference, does show that they really have made a major advance from 5.15 to 4.3mm with this iconic design, with that skeletonized movement, with the inset dial. Now, the final watch I'd like to talk about is another extremely slim record-breaking watch, which is the Breguet Classique Tourbillon Extra-Plat Automatique 5367. And this is the world's slimmest tourbillon, and is a continuation of this of the model 5377, which is a version of this watch with a different dial and layout. And the watch is 42mm in diameter by 7.45mm in thickness, which next to that Piaget does seem significantly thicker, but when one has to bear in mind the fact that a tourbillon takes a significant amount of height rather than width, as it has those number of components which have to be placed above each other. And this features an eccentric dial, as on various Breguet pocket watches, purely to accommodate that tourbillon at that 4:30, 5 o'clock sort of position on the dial. And of course, to save space, they've also skeletonized it to remove the additional thickness that there would have to be if they were going to place the dial over the top of it. And this model is notable because it features a Grand Feu dial, and Breguet have been pushing these quite a lot this year, as far as their enamel, handmade enamel dials go. And this offers a wonderfully classical look to this watch, which would traditionally have had a Guilloche style of metal dial, which is far more elaborate, but in some ways doesn't have the elegance of this dial. Also, the watch which this is based on, the 5377, features a power reserve indicator, whereas this goes without that, which I think was a good choice. And as far as tourbillons go, this is about as far from ostentatious as you can get, with that very simple dial in enamel, with those little details at every 5-minute marker, as well as those blued Breguet-style hands, and that second hand which is placed as a point on the tourbillon assembly. And this watch is genuinely very interesting from a technical perspective as well, because it has the additional complication of a titanium tourbillon cage and silicon escapement, which allows it to move really further into the 21st century. But in terms of case build, this watch is available in rose gold, as you can see, with these wonderful machined edges with that folded gold along those sides of the case, which are very reminiscent of Breguet's history and their older models, and I think is always something that I love to see on the sides of these spectacular timepieces. And in terms of the movement of this watch, and forgive the fact that I'm using a picture of the back of the 5377 because I haven't yet seen any publicly available photographs of the back of this particular model, but the movement is the same, apart from the fact that there isn't a power reserve indicator on this model. And this version is the caliber 581 movement from Breguet, which is this beautiful hand-engraved movement with a 4 Hz beat rate, and of course that titanium tourbillon with its silicon escapement. And the remarkable thing is that despite the fact that this watch is only 7.45mm thick, it still has an 80-hour power reserve, which is more than most brands can manage on any thickness of watch, which is very impressive for a watch of this size. And of course the price for this watch is astronomical. It's $149,500, which is significantly less though than the version with the power reserve indicator and the guilloché style of dial, but nonetheless is an incredibly large amount of money. But I feel as far as a celebration of the tourbillon and of true craftsmanship, this watch is unrivaled in terms of being a true remake of traditional watchmaking, but in a very different way to, for example, FP Journe, with a typical Breguet flair. And so I'll conclude this video here, but thank you very much for watching, and do leave your comments down below as to what you thought of these watches, and indeed if you thought there were any others of this pre-SIHH release stage that I should have included. And if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is the Watch Guy, over and out.